Thank you for joining Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. We're coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday. You can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on our website and on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speakers today, you can email them directly with the contact information you'll see on the last slide. All right, just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C. based firm and provide services for federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us there. We do offer newsletter advertising, so you can email this email if you'd like more information on that. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Our speakers today are Marcia Lindquist and Michael Gallo, and they're going to be covering profit versus competitive price, striking a balance. Thank you for joining us today, Marcia and Michael. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you guys.
Thank you, Mallory. Are the slides up? I'm not seeing them on the screen. There we go. Thank you.
That's perfect. Thank you.
And can you advance to? Perfect. So thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Mike Gallo. I'm here with Marcia Lindquist, and we're going to talk about pricing versus profits. I guess to get started in the webinar, we want to start with kind of the broad overview of the landscape, as that affects your view of the world and whether or not you're focusing more on the pricing end or more on the profit end. So I'll start with the first bullet. Your view of well, let's say that the government has recovered in terms of its spending. The budget austerity that we witnessed a few years ago has eased, and spending has recovered. But your view of that spending recovery depends on your client base and your offerings. So if you're in hot areas such as the intelligence community, artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity, you're seeing increased spending and you're seeing emphasis on technical capability, less emphasis on price. On the other end, if you're in the infrastructure end of the business and doing back-end work for the government, such as acquisition support, you're seeing less spending and more emphasis on price and cost saving. So your view of the world is much different than the other end. Marcia, you want to hit the other two?
I do. We're seeing a lot of consolidated procurements out there, meaning that where we used to see 2 or 3 requirements or even more requirements, we're seeing some of those getting, if you will, bundled together into one procurement or 2 procurements in order for the contracts community to go after them in what the government sees as a more efficient fashion. What that translates to is that there are more contractors because people see the government space as something that is a very lucrative space if they can win, but we're also seeing fewer contracts. What that means is that what that translates to is there's a bigger demand for competitive pricing, and sometimes that competitive pricing means that it's at the risk of your profit margins. And when that happens, we get a squeezing that we're talking about today. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about the choices that you've got to make, and that's the genesis of this particular presentation today. Do we have to choose between competitive price or profits? And in the government space, on the competitive pricing side, the government wants to have a lot of competition so that they have what they see as the most competitive price. They're not always going to go after competitive, low price technically acceptable, LPTA. If it's a best value procurement, they still want to ensure that it is affordable for the taxpayer and that they're getting the best deal. When you are going after your competitive procurements, you want to take a look at the strategic factors probably more than anything else, because you don't have to choose between your profit margin and to get to a low price. You can look at lots of other factors in order to get to a competitive price, but you also want to make sure that you do increase your probability of winning, your P-win, so that you have what is the most competitive price. To do that, you need to look right at all of your factors, including profit, and Mike's going to talk about profit in just a second. But if you don't want to win a bid, but you want to go after it, you want to say, hey, we're going to submit a bid, you could actually decline work by putting in a higher price and actually not winning. And you may ask, why would I ever want to do that, Marcia? And sometimes you want to be able to do that to perhaps throw off your competition. Sometimes you want to let them know that that's a price so that when you go after something that you really do want to win, your competition is potentially seeing some of that ultimate bottom line pricing, and they can see that those are your numbers, and you may want to throw them off. But you can do very, very much in the strategic factors area in order to make your price very competitive. Mike, you want to talk about profits?
Yeah, I do. I think there's a sense on the government side that profit's a dirty word, and that the government doesn't like contractors to make profit, and that's unfortunate. Profit is not a four-letter word, and in fact, FAR 15 clearly states profit is an essential motivator of efficient and effective contract performance. And I'm going to give you a quote from FAR 15. It is in the government's interest to offer contractors opportunities for financial rewards sufficient to stimulate efficient contract performance, attract the best capabilities of qualified large and small business concerns to government contracts, and maintain a viable industrial base, unquote. All the factors that we listed on the right for profits are all essential ingredients for companies to be a viable business. If you're in business and bidding on contracts, especially cost plus contracts, you should not be bidding a profit of less than 2 to 3% on cost type contracts, no matter how much the competitiveness in the space is. That's the minimum that's needed to recoup your unallowable but legitimate costs, such as interest expense. So consider that to be a floor. Marcia, let's move on to the next slide. What are some profit levers?
Yeah, and let me say one other thing about that. It's in the government's interest for you to make a profit on what Mike was talking about in the last slide. You don't have to go back to the last slide, but I want to say this. It's in the government's interest for you to make a profit because they want you to stay in business. They want companies to flourish. They want companies to be able to be there for the next competition, and they don't want you to go out of business or lose money, because ultimately that means they have to re-procure what they just procured from you. So it's in your interest and the government's interest for you to make a profit. So on this next slide, we're going to talk about some profit levers. Things in the cost reimbursable space mean that I'm going to start at the last one. There is a cap in the FAR on proposed fee rate for cost reimbursable contracts. You can't bid and get a contract for more than 10% of your cost base. Now, having said that, when you do negotiate your contract and you do bid what you're going to bid for that profit, it's a fixed fee on that contract, and you can't change that profit as you go through contract performance. Whatever you bid is a fixed fee, and you're going to be earning that if you perform the contract. You can't adjust. You can adjust the proposed fee rate as you are bidding it. You can change that. But like Mike was saying, you wouldn't want to go below 2-3%. Sometimes I even like to say as much as 4%, depending upon your company and what your unallowable costs and your cost of growing the business are. You can adjust your proposed cost base, which is where those levers are that I was talking about for your strategic pricing. You can work within that cost base to make your cost reimbursable contract important, but that means that you're going to reduce your fee as well because it is based on your cost. So Mike, you want to talk about on the fixed price side?
Yes, thank you, Marcia. So on the fixed price side, you have many more levers to pull to adjust profit margins. And unfortunately for many companies, they still select the easy lever, which is just to adjust the actual proposed profit margin and don't spend as much time thinking about some other potential levers. And so, if you think about on a fixed price contract, if you save $1 of cost, that's $1 of cost that can be shared between your higher profit, but also the client's lower price. You can decide how to allocate that $1 of savings when you're proposing on a contract. So for example, on a large fixed price contract where your indirect rates might go down because the fixed costs are spread over a larger business base, you have surplus profit dollars generated. And savvy firms will look at that impact at proposal time, and they'll actually adjust their indirect rates, adjust their forecasts, and simultaneously improve their pricing position while also improving their profit margins. And that same process can be followed for the other factors that I've listed there, for productivity improvements, farming out work to maybe a lower price sub, and thinking about your contingency dollars to address risk. Those ultimately will translate into larger profit dollars that you can decide how much to allocate to price and how much to allocate to your bottom line profit. All of those levers take time to analyze. So the moral on that is, if you do your homework and you do it early, it can have a tremendous impact on your return on investment in terms of larger profits for both you and a more competitive price that helps your client. So on the next slide, Marcia, when should we focus on price?
And I do want to talk about one thing relative to the LPTA part that's right at the top of the list. LPTA, low price technically acceptable, has been a large part of our landscape for a number of years. I think that landscape is changing, Mike. And I want to point out to everybody to take a look at a proposed rule that was issued recently on a change to the federal acquisition regulations, where DoD, GSA, and NASA are proposing to amend the federal regulations to implement a section of the John McCain National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year this year, which specifies that the criteria that must be met in order to include LPTA source selection criteria in a solicitation will be limited. So that's out for comment. The comments are due by December 2nd, so people ought to know that's up and coming. I suspect it will happen. So when do you want to focus on competitive price? Well, you certainly want to focus on it if it's an LPTA, low price technically acceptable bid, because you know that that's where the government is going to go. I've seen the case, Mike, where the government tells you actually in the RFP that they're going to open all the bids and they will evaluate the technical side of it for the lowest price bidder. And if it's acceptable, technically acceptable, they will take that bid. And that's an extreme, but I have seen that happen. So if it's a competitive bid and you know it says LPTA, you got to keep that in mind. You got to also keep in mind when an agency is consistently awarding to the low-priced bidder, you ought to know whether it's the low-rated bidder, because it's possible that that bidder who is winning consistently, or the agency that is awarding to the low-price bidder, if that's what you want to do, then you are dealing more in the commodity market. It's less so, as Mike mentioned at the beginning of this session, where we're in the cyberspace or artificial intelligence areas. And those, by the way, are the areas where LPTA is going to be eliminated. So here's the other thing for you. If it's a must-win for you contract, you know that you've got to take out all the stops to get to the low price technically acceptable bid. That means you have to take into consideration all of the things that Mike and I have talked about on the last slide in order to be able to strategically get to your costs that are lower and a profit margin that you can live with, which brings back the last point here, affordability. It has to be affordable to the government, but it also has to be affordable to you as the bidder. Mike, you want to talk about the profitability side of this?
Yeah, certainly if you're going after fixed price contracts, profit has to be part of the consideration. And I would say Marcia mentioned earlier that on the cost plus side, there's a maximum fee that you can propose on a typical cost plus contract if it's not engineering and architecture type services or R&D, it's 10%. That may not be an appropriate profit for you to be bidding on fixed price work, given the nature of you're on the hook to deliver, and so you're taking on the risk of potential cost growth if you can't deliver at the proposed cost. It's entirely reasonable to be having a higher profit on those jobs to account for that risk. As Marcia said, looking at agencies and looking at their behaviors of awarding to lower priced, lower rated bidders, the same is true on the other side. Focus on profits when buyers are clearly demonstrating that they will pay a premium for superior technical performance. I'll give you an example. I just read a recent GAO protest where the winner's price was 58% higher than the protester's price, and this winner prevailed in the protest. So this particular winner clearly understood their client, and the winner clearly understood their own capabilities. And by doing their homework, they didn't leave any money on the table. And finally, I would say, hopefully you're going to get to the point where you're really cranking and you're at capacity in your firm in terms of busting at the seams, and everybody's booked and everybody's busy. This might be the opportunity to start focusing more on profits, looking at your portfolio of contracts and business, and making some strategic decisions to prune that portfolio so that you can free up resources to pursue higher profit, higher margin work. Marcia, let's talk about some of the key takeaways on some of these decisions on the next slide.
Excellent. So here's the thing. On the decisions that you've got to make, you need to take a look at, is it winnable? If you're going to trade off profit and still lose, is that a signal you want to give the government and maybe potentially your competitors? Because sometimes that information is gettable by your competitors. You want to make sure that when you go after something, can we win it? If you're only going to be trading off profit, then I would say you're probably not necessarily going to win it. If you haven't looked at the other factors, the other cost factors, and some of the things that Mike talked about 2 slides ago with efficiency gains, learning proficiency gains, staff greening, that kind of thing, then you probably are only focused on profit. You're probably not going to win. So here's the thing. If you are reducing your proposed cost so low that you lose money, then I'm saying to you, why are you even bidding it? There are times when I'll say to some of our clients, if it's not gettable, if it's not winnable, and you are shortchanging your profitability, then sometimes it's best, and Mike will talk about some of this on his next part of this slide, sometimes it's best to walk away. So if your profitability is in question, I'm asking you to consider sometimes not even bidding it. And then, of course, there's the question, if you did win it, you know, I always say to some clients, the good news is you've won, the bad news is you've won. And if you win and you're not able to execute the contract profitably and in a good performance fashion, then you've not won, you've lost. I've had clients who come to me in pain because they are losing money for every hour that they've got people working on a contract. Makes it very, very hard to execute the contract. So, Mike, you want to launch into some of the key takeaways for this?
Yeah, I think in the interest of time, let me leave you with one little blurb. Marcia mentioned about the must-win contract. I have a real-world example earlier this year. The client had a must-win contract. It was low price, technically acceptable bid. 3% profit is probably what was needed to win the bid. The client didn't want to go below 3%. He bid 4% because he said he had to make enough money to make it worth his while. And you can guess what happened. they lost this must-win bid, and now they have 0 sales from this contract and 0 profit. So if you say must-win, you know, price is much more heavily weighted. You can't have these kinds of conflicting priorities. If it's must-win, your focus is on price, not on profit. Marcia, I think we're almost up on time here. Let's wrap up with final thoughts on the last slide.
Absolutely. So we look at this as baking a cake. When you bake a cake, you don't just throw a bunch of ingredients inside the oven and not mix them up. You don't wait until you know the oven's heated up and then take flour and sugar and eggs and just throw it inside the oven walls. You step back. You strategize about what you've got to do. When you're baking a cake, is the same as preparing for a bid. You begin at the sources sought stage or even before. If you even know something is going to be coming out. In my opinion, and Mike's opinion too, I'll say this for you, Mike, when the solutioning is happening and you're designing your teams, that is the time for you to begin your pricing strategy. It's the best time to begin strategic pricing. You can be doing indirect rate impacts. You could be looking at labor. You could be looking at staffing. You could be looking at, while you're doing your research on the incumbent, this is where it is the best time to do all those things that Mike and I have talked about today. Because at that stage, you can really make a difference in what your company is going to do based on the knowledge you're gaining. Mike, other thoughts on when the RFP comes out?
I would say this final thought, that clearly working on and going through these steps involves spending some amount of time, resources, and money to make it happen. And sometimes there's a tendency to really treat this kind of as an expense to be minimized. I think we've clearly shown today, though, that doing these steps and doing these things and doing your homework can potentially have a tremendous return on investment in terms of helping you get to a price that's not only winnable, but hopefully also optimizes the amount of profit that you can win on these jobs. The only way you can get to that is by doing this good amount of homework and doing it in a timely fashion. And that's all I have.
That's all I have too. And so here we've got our contact information, our phone numbers, our emails. We'll certainly take questions if people have those on either of those methods.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike and Marcia, for joining us today. We have another webinar right after this, so we'll see you all then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.